Museum of Activism Syria Exhibit. This is the launch, as I'm sure many of you know. We're happy to see so many of you on a Friday evening. I heard there was a very interesting music festival happening in Berlin, so we're happy so many friends have been joining us. I think you know most of us. I'm not going to spend a lot of your time introducing the panel. Most of my colleagues are very well known. My name is Rime Allaf. I'm a Syrian-born writer. I'm delighted to be joined by Yassin Al Haj Saleh, who is an eminent Syrian writer and a Syrian intellectual. Those of you who do not speak Arabic and cannot follow his writings in Arabic would be very interested, I'm sure, to read his book, The Impossible Revolution, in English, and also a lot of his writings on the website Al which he co-founded, I believe, or founded? Okay. And I'm joined also, delighted to have Joumana Seif with us. My friend Joumana is also an eminent Syrian activist, a human rights activist, and she's a lawyer, and she's been involved, and I'm sure she'll tell us a little bit about some of the trials happening in Germany for perpetrators of crimes against humanity and war crimes, Syrians who came to Germany, and this is a very important part of activism about which we'll talk. We didn't really want to have a very rigid, typical panel, and that's why we tried to be amongst ourselves here, all of us on one level. The Museum of Activism is about the search for a life of dignity, a life of justice, a life of equality. And what the museum has been trying to show through the various exhibits that it will host is that all activists, in essence, share common goals. And Syrians are not different from the other activists. And today we want to remember and talk through amongst ourselves with you about the early days of the Syrian Revolution, which 10 years after its start seems so far behind. And even as we were gathering, we were remembering stories that are not anymore in our immediate memory. We have forgotten the exhilaration of the first days, the hope of the first days that so many Syrians shared. And we tend to think of the Syrian Revolution as having begun in mid-March, March 15, March 18, there's two camps of 2011. But I was mentioning to Yassin and Joumana today that for me there was a date previous to that, an event which was a spontaneous protest, a demonstration that happened in Haria in Damascus, which is an area close to the Hamidiyya Souk, for those who know it. And some of the security forces had mistreated one of the young shopkeepers there. And everybody decided this was enough. What really caught my attention that day was that for the first time in Syria, because it was immediately put on social media and on YouTube, was all these young people, mostly young men because they were the shopkeepers of the area, holding up their phones like this and recording what was happening. And at that moment when I saw it was not really on TV, it was, we're all on our laptops and on our phones, I felt that something clicked for the Syrians. We were still watching Tunisia, we were watching Egypt. We weren't sure what was going to happen there. But if we weren't sure, Bashar Assad, in that same month of February, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal. And in that interview, when asked about the Arab Spring, he was very confident in saying that Syria would not be touched, would remain untouched by this wave that was the Arab Spring. He was very confident. A few weeks later, in mid-March, those of you who follow Syria know the history, and it is history, and these are facts. And we need to stress that 10 years after, that there was a situation with children in Daraa, that they did write some graffiti on the walls, that they were arrested and abused and tortured, that the families and the elders went to the governor and pleaded with him to release the kids, And the governor told them, forget those kids, and if you want to have more children, go make some, and if you don't know how, send us your wives, we'll do them. I think it's very important to remind ourselves of those very first moments of the Syrian revolution. And I was myself in Vienna when it started, and I remember desperately wanting to be in Syria. And I know that both of you were in Syria at the time. And you saw firsthand, both of you, what happened. And I'd like us to remember a little bit about those first days. Tell us, what was your experience? Did you experience anything? Or what did you feel when you saw them, Yassin?
So, hello, and thank you for having me here. I was at home, actually, in Damascus. I am a writer, so I keep working. And my friend, my great friend, Razan Zaytouna, called me that she sent me a video, a short video of thousands of people, few thousands, maybe 2,000, 3,000, which is still very big in Syria. Relatively, it is a huge thing. And people shouting, الشعب السوري ما بينذل, which means that the Syrian people would not be humiliated. So this sense of dignity was, I think, the main motivation behind the protest at that time. And everything is political in Syria. I mean, though it started because cop, actually, he was not a security person, head, it seems, a young guy. Though it started this way, it was extremely political. And in a few minutes, the Minister of Interior was there. And he calmed down, or tried to calm down the people gathering. And at the same time, in a way, there was a threat that this is a protest. This is mudahara in Arabic, which means a demonstration or something like this. And the people were ambivalent. They were hesitant a bit. So they said no, though it was actually a protest against one of the symbols of the regime. But it is. I mean, I'm mentioning this just to remember Razan, who she was abducted some 8 years ago. In less than 2 months, it will be 8 years. And she was, I'll come back to Razan later, hopefully.
Yes.
But yeah, so she was one of the most prominent female activists in Syria, human rights activist and a lawyer. And she's, if there is one symbol of the Syrian struggle at that time and up to now, it would be Razan, in my opinion.
Joumana, what about your perspective and your memories?
My memories, hi everyone first. Also that demonstration that we all followed, and it was like really a big surprise, a positive surprise, and we felt that something would change in Syria also, because we were spending most of our time at that time, in front of the TV, following that's what's happening in Tunisia and Cairo. So, but the first day for me was on the 16th of March, and that day was also a very big demonstration, if we can say, in front of the Ministry of Interior. And I remember here, I'll come to the role of Razan, because I remember very well how we organized, or how they, I don't want to put myself there, but I was there in the military court. We were together and we started the discussion to organize this demonstration in front of the Ministry of Interior. And we had two ideas or two opinions. One of to let it very small, just the family of the political prisoner, because they at that time they started a hunger strike.
So allow me just, the idea was that it's a protest by the families of
Yeah.
the people arrested. So there was sort of a debate, either it is restricted to the families, only the families, or
yeah.
they can be joined by
to make
others.
it open and to call for the other. And women, they struggled to have it bigger, and Razan Zaytoun was
One of them,
One
yeah.
of them. And we managed, but at that moment, it was at 11 o'clock, and the security police from that moment, they showed their brutality and how they really dealt with these families and women, and the majority were women actually. They started to surround us in small circles and beating women, men, everybody, and also we drove the people with the taxi, and then to be arrested, to be taken to the security branches.
But I
A
mean,
lot
this
of
is not
people-
surprising for people like
Not
you.
surprising, but we saw that a huge number of security services personnel there. Even the head, the leader of them, Tawfiq Younes, was there, and many. And we realized that even they do not know each other.
Mhm.
You know, it's like they were surprised of each other even by the name. So, and that's what started. But really, the determination of the people, the activists, and no
Let me
doubt.
just add to this that Taib Tizidi, a Syrian
Yeah.
intellectual, he was in his 70s, I guess 75 or something. He passed away 3 or 4 years ago, was there, and he was beaten.
Yeah.
And Maymoun Al-Ammar was the wife of, she was an activist and the wife of an activist, well-known activist, Usama Nassar. She was pregnant, she was about to give birth, and she was arrested, and she spent, fortunately at that, in those early days, she spent maybe 2 weeks or something like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she got off easily in
Yes,
such
at that time actually,
yes.
yeah, at that time they were beating people, they were
Yes.
arresting them for days or
Yeah.
a few weeks, yeah.
So Al-Qasi was arrested.
Yeah, Suhail was arrested, yeah.
Nahid Badawiya,
I
Wafa.
think it's important to make a small precision. The people who were doing this at the start, apart from the one in the souk, were people who were already active in one way or another in whatever we want to call a political movement or a human rights movement. What happened afterwards was all of a sudden open to all Syrians. And I think it's the perfect segue to bring us to the next part, because Syrians were both knowledgeable about their regime. They knew exactly what to expect, even if they hadn't lived it themselves. Because at the beginning of the revolution, after Daraa, and after Daraa became besieged by the regime, you all remember Baytna al-Halib, the milk statement. After the Assad regime put a siege around Daraa, a lot of Syrians signed something called the milk statement, which is a literal translation, which was basically people asking the regime to at least let the children of Daraa have milk. So it was it was an exaggeration, hyperbole, but that was the point, that let's not take this far. I think this was also a breaking point for a lot of Syrians, where some who had signed this statement, including some actors and actresses, I remember at the time some people who were not necessarily involved, immediately were put in their place by the regime. And I think this became a point where Syrians knew that this was the turning point. You either went in, all in, or you stayed behind. And that was the period where we began to see extremely inspirational scenes in Damascus, in greater Damascus, in Daraa, in Homs, in Banyas, in Raqqa, in Hasaki, in Aleppo. You remember Joumana Seif? The Aleppo University, the young students who climbed on top of the big sign. And we weren't seeing yet at the time, the revolution flag was not being used yet. These were still youngsters, a lot of young people, going out and spread. This is why we have those bottles, and we will come to speak about the young people of Daraya who were doing everything in their power to show that this was silmiye.
Yeah.
That was the word you heard a lot. If you go back on YouTube and watch the videos, you'll see that at the beginning everybody was saying حرية, so freedom, karame, dignity, but also silmiye, which is peaceful, non-violent. And I want to stress that because today, 10 years later, not even 10 years later, immediately after a year or two, we had, I need to use my hands, experts on Syria, talking about the civil war, talking about the proxy wars, and talking a lot of nonsense from the beginning. And I want us to remember right now those non-violent, those peaceful youngsters who were full of excitement, who felt they were part of something big. And of course, they were inspired by the Arab Spring. They saw Tunis, they saw Cairo. And I'd like us to remind our friends everywhere that there were a few months, and we had one of the big videos from Hama, which we Syrians call it Millionia. It might not have been 1 million, but in any other country, it would have been equivalent to 3-4 million people. So insane was the thought that Syrians could come out and have a massive protest because Syrians knew what waited for them. Yassin, what are your thoughts on the spread of these demonstrations?
Well, there was a context. It was Syria was the 6th country after Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Libya. And we were encouraged by the fact that the protests, peaceful protests of Tunisian, led to the overthrow of the regime in 4 weeks. In Egypt, in less than 3 weeks, 18 days actually, and the whole world saw Maidan Tahrir Square with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and the regime was toppled. And there were in Manama, Bahrain's capital, they tried to imitate the Egyptian example. And we tried to do this in Syria actually, in Homs, in April 18, and around midnight they were attacked by the regime, and we don't know the number of victims. Some people from Homs say 200, and they were even, the bodies were of the killed were taken by bulldozers. Maybe there's an exaggeration. No one knows really how many people were killed. And I was a witness, an eyewitness in April 2011 of people coming from many neighborhoods and suburbs of Damascus to Al Abbasiyin Square. And they couldn't arrive. Thousands of people. They couldn't arrive because they were met by bullets and by Shabiha. I saw the buses bringing Shabiha and security people at the time. So by default, the mode of the Syrian uprising was peaceful because it was in this context of peaceful uprising. Actually, at the time we thought that we found finally the magic formula for political change. The biggest number possible of people occupying a central. So, Syria tried it actually. Because it failed, we saw later this fragmentation. It took much time because peaceful demonstration continued up to July 2012. So 16 months after the beginning of the uprising, but extreme fragmentation. So,
Yes.
in places in Homs and Raqqa and Aleppo, and Damascus itself, Kafr Sousa, for instance, or Barz al-Balad, or so in many places without being able to meet in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in a square, in a big square. Of course, if it was for a moment, if we imagine that this was possible, this would have encouraged more pluralistic, more peaceful, and more politicized approach to the struggle. Because of this fragmentation and because people were isolated and the regime was ruling the country for 41 years at that time, so
Indeed.
yeah, almost 2 generations. Because of this, some later developments, their seeds were there because we couldn't imitate Tahrir Square model.
May I add to what you're saying, Yassin? This is absolutely correct that it went on, these peaceful protests, until well into 2012, in spite of the fact that the regime was already following the military route from the early months of the revolution. And I think this is important to, for ourselves and to remind others that it did not turn violent or armed on all sides at the same time.
No.
Most of the people who were doing these protests and who were inspiring others to do them, even though the daily number of victims was rising, we were talking, first it was 10, then 15, then 20. The regime was testing every day.
Allow me to interrupt that.
Yeah, please.
Before I forget.
It's
I
okay.
was also there in Homs on March 25, so just a week or 10 days after the formal beginning of the Syrian uprising, with Samira, my wife, and other young activists.
Samira, who works with
Razan
Baytna, for those who are unfamiliar.
Yeah. So there was also the first gathering of protesters. It was 25 in the afternoon, March 25 in the afternoon, 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Also thousands, maybe 3,000, 4,000 people. And it was, there was a sort of a cordon. It was siege, the gathering. There was a young girl on the shoulder of a man. I think it was her father. Expressing, I don't remember actually the words, but sort of protest against the regime. And there were security forces all around. And at certain moments there were tension between the protesters and the security men. And so every minute or every half a minute, some people would say their highest pitch of Selmiya, because to try to contain the tension. They were afraid that people would get angry and they may push or...
If they were provoked.
Yeah. So Selmiya, because people were aware, very full aware, that they would be crushed if it gets violent. And this is because also we have a very big experience in Syria itself. The wave that started with the uprising in 2011 is the second wave of struggle in Syria, ruled by the Assad family since 1970. When I was young, at the university, I was a university student, there was a wave of struggle. And there were Islamists and with violent Islamists, but it was also the university. I was at the University of Aleppo, and there were trade unions involved in this, and some political activists at that time, and tens of thousands of people were arrested and tortured, and tens of thousands were killed in Hama, and many small massacres.
We're talking about the early 80s.
So that's why there was a conscious effort to avoid any violence.
Indeed. Knowing what they're capable of, and nevertheless, they continued when they could. Isn't that right, Joumana?
Yeah. So, and also here, I remember very clear that women, they played also a very important role in this, because they started to organize themselves to be connected in many areas, to also just to advocate for the peacefully. It's like just to keep all these movements peaceful. And I think social media also played a very important role. They were amazing. They started to organize themselves, to be connected, to create like their networks, to find a way to use like fake names and to recognize each other, but also to protect themselves. And this is how, like, suddenly you could find, we called it flyer demonstration or something like that, flyer demonstration. Yeah. So, and I think it was like amazing movement led by the youth of and I think that those people, the young women and men, also they did not experience the brutality of the regime at the 80s, because in our generation we knew that it's how it comes. So they were really very brave.
Yes.
And but also to be honest, they were well prepared, because I know tens of stories of the activists who were arrested many times, were tortured, were humiliated, but in the same day when they were released, they will join another demonstration. It's a friend of mine, she was arrested, threatened there, and yes, the lecture her with all this loyalty to the country, and then in the afternoon she was released. Exactly after 2 hours, she dyed her hair, changed the color, and participated in another demonstration. This is the spirits of the country at that time, and I think the revolution really brings the good things of every one of us. So at that time, it was clear the solidarity between people and what the sacrifice, everything, all this, the support, and I remember very well that from years, the 1 year and the second, the revolution was funded. It's from pure Syrian.
That's a very important point.
Yeah, and even the people, they did not participate in the demonstration, but they wanted to support, to contribute to the.
Yes.
They contribute with money just to support people who are wounded or affected from the brutality of the regime. This is how the atmosphere in Syria was 2011.
One of solidarity.
Solidarity.
And this is an important point. I'm going to jump on what you just said, Joumana. First of all, the participation of women. This would need another session all by itself, but I think it's important to remember also that
others were in jail. A few fled the country, and a few were able to live underground for long years, some of them for 20 years. So religion came to play the role of the limit of poverty, political poverty. I mean by political poverty that the right to gather, to meet others in public spaces, and to talk about public issues. So when you are denied talking about public issues and gather with others in public spaces, this means that the Syrians were under political poverty line. That's why in the days of Damascus Spring, the forums were about what? They were gatherings of dozens of people, or a few hundreds, 200, 300, talking about politics. That's all. It is just people want to own politics. So, and I think my analysis about the Syrian revolution, it was all about owning politics, all about expressing people, expressing themselves and gathering and coming together, because they were extremely, the Syrian society was extremely atomized. So religion played this role because the only gathering that cannot be disbanded, even by a brutal regime like ours, is the gathering of believers at a mosque. Exactly. Or a church, by the way, for that matter.
Of course.
And the only opinion that cannot be muted or prevented from being expressed is scriptures. It's holy scriptures. Is the Adhan, is the texts that believers recite at mosques. So that's why. But of course, this is dangerous. I mean, when religion comes to play political role, this is sectarianism. And when violence comes to it, we will be in a very bad situation. But I mean, it is our regime and in Egypt and in Tunisia and in Libya and in Bahrain, it was the same. Religion came to play political role because people were denied organizing themselves and talking about public issues. In a way, one can say that religion is the you know that Marcus said in his days that religion is the soul of soulless societies, or the spirit of societies without spirit. I think for Islam, at least, it is politics of societies denied political rights.
It applies in a lot of places, but without a doubt, by default, precisely because of what Yassin is explaining, we started hearing a lot at one point about Jum'at kaza.
Yeah.
So the Fridays had different names. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because at that point, there was a little bit more of an organization, of a structure to some activist movements. And I would really like us to spend some time talking and remembering the local coordination committees, which played a huge role and which we look on with marvel, really, that how they managed. And I know that you were extremely involved. Tell us about what it took, how it started. These were a network of local councils, committees, all over Syria, at a time when the regime was beginning to show to Syrians and to the world that there was no violent act that they would not commit to quell this revolution. Please tell us, both of you, tell us about the local coordination committees. Tell our friends.
I think we first should differentiate between local coordinating committees and the other coordinating committee, because many people tend to think local coordinating committees as a generic name for tansiqiyat. No, this is not true. Local coordinating communities, where all of them, what they have in common is that they are youthful political bodies that appeared with the revolution. So they were not existent before the revolution. The local coordinating committees were established by young activists, the most prominent among whom was Razan Zaytouna himself, and others in their 30s. Razan was at that time 34. Others younger a bit or a bit older. It is, I would say, because there was another group called Tansiqiyat Thawra Syria, which means the coordinating bodies of the Syrian revolution. The difference between, and there was, to be honest, there was sort of a tension between the local coordinating committees were more secular, so to speak. Without pushing this too much, the ideological element was not very, very, very apparent, but it was there. And the Tansiqiyat Thawra Syria, or the coordinating bodies of the were a bit more conservative. The role of the local coordinating committees was to organize protests, to cover the activities, the revolutionary activities, to come with initiatives, and later, actually, which took more effort and more resources around the end of the first year of the revolution, relief. At that time, relief was still a revolutionary thing. I mean, it is part of your role to help the people who were, who lost a house, or many members were in jail or whatever, to help them. Then it became a huge thing, and even, a burden even on states, not only on a network of activists in Syria. The second thing was documentation. Especially after almost 2 years of the uprising, documentation became even more vital, because we had an instinct that our story will not be told. We need to tell it as honest, as precise as it has happened. Because also we were afraid of being ignored, but also we were afraid of exaggerations. And these two roles were played greatly by local coordinating committees, and especially by Razan in person. The center of her activities moved from relief and from organizing protests,
Yes.
to documentation, which exceeds the powers of these networks. So, but they did a very decent job, and they were the documentation violation documentation center was the most credible Syrian source of information. And I don't follow now, but they were for sure the most credible. And people, they have network covering almost the whole country at that time. So credible and on the ground.
All these are definitely incredible priorities for most of the activists, but I also want to mention that they also played a political role with the Declaration about the Republic and the Declaration of Dignity. And I would invite all our guests, after our talk, we have printed copies of the early days of the revolution. This was at the end of 2011. These were signed by
Before that, they published in June. These are around the end of the year. The paper about Al-Jumhuriyah and the paper about dignity around the end of 2000.
Yes.
لجان التنسيق المحلية, the local coordinating committees published a political statement in June.
Yes, but
before
we don't have
than any other political body, before any else. I mean, the Moscow Declaration or Hayat al-Tansiq or whatever.
Yep.
It was before mid-June 2011.
So exactly, so confirming that they had a gathering and organizational role, there was connection between the different Syrian areas, and there was a very strong political statement.
Yes, exactly. They played, they took the lead at the revolution, and that's why. And I think I agree with Yassin, everything that at the beginning of the revolution, I think all the coordination committees, we can say that they were more secular, but in the second year they became a little bit, the direction went to be more
Drifted,
religious.
yeah.
Because even all the protests, all the demonstration, they were in Syria. The first year they were mixed, all diversity. And I remember even in Jame Al Hassan, in the middle of Al Midan, which is very conservative.
In Damascus.
Area. That's my area. I remember that everyone from all the minorities, from all the background of the Syrian people, like the youth and the older people, and they were there. Even in the protests in Al Midan, it was amazing that I met there my cousins and some of my relatives who are really conservative in the demonstration, with friends who are very, it's like secular.
Yes.
So yeah, it was mixed, and the way they were really raising their voice together, dancing together, and it was amazing. This is the Syrian people.
Absolutely. It was cross-cutting at the beginning.
Exactly.
And it's a good point. I think we've been talking now about things which you cannot see in this exhibit. We're talking about ideals and coordination and protest. But what you can see are a few of the ways that activists in Syria tried, to send and voice their message and their calls in a certain number of ways. One of those that we have are those very small ping pong balls on which they wrote words like Hadriye, Karami, I forgot which ones we have here. And they would throw them in certain areas of cities in Syria. And, the security services and the policemen and the cops and the Shabiha would run like crazy trying to catch them. What do you remember? We had a talk. We have so many different ways that we could not physically bring to the Museum of Activism. Remind us. Do you remember the fountain?
Yeah, the fountain.
The fountain.
Yeah, the red fountain in Bab Musalla
Yes.
Square. Also, it's close to the Al Midan. It's very. They were very creative, and I remember some discussion. Also, Yassin was there. Remember, with some activists. The creativity to what to do small things and then small act, but with very really big influence. And I remember also the recording, and then once in Arnous Square in the top in
Under
the
the Central Bank.
Damascus,
Under the
and
Central Bank.
Yeah, Central Bank.
We have some of those here. What Joumana is referring to, the red, is that activists overnight would put red dye. And Damascus, for instance,
In the
is known for its
fountains.
many fountains. And they would wake up and find, the water red and everything.
Like it was blood.
Exactly, to represent this. So there were so many instances of peaceful, non-violent activism and people working together.
Actually, I think that for 16 months, was not for a month or 2 or 3, a protest became sort of an art with songs, with popular songs mostly. We have so many videos and so many songs that became known to all Syrians. And one of them, very famous, is Kashush. There's a debate if it was this name or there's a possible debate, but the songs are there, and they were in with شو الميكروفون المكبر الصوت
الميجافون.
Yeah, الميجافون. Yeah, heard in with the presence of hundreds of thousands in Hama. One of the famous names of this convergence between protest and art is the Martin Abbas Sarut, who became later a fighter. But before this, he was just a protester. Actually, he was a footballer, a goalkeeper, then he became a protester and a singer. He was a young, handsome guy. And he's a symbol, actually. I think he can be studied as a symbol of the Syrian struggle, and it is different stages because there are very distinct stages actually. We can talk about the first year and a half up to 2 years to the first stage when it was peaceful for 6-7 months, then peaceful and with armed struggle. This is the Syrian civil war. Then the national setting of the struggle collapsed, and it became no longer Syrian versus Syrian struggle. Then, of course, we know that it became chaotic situation after the chemical massacre, then the chemical deal, then the American intervention 2014, then the Russian intervention 2015, then Turkish intervention 2016, and so, I mean, it is not fair to think of the present situation as just a seed that was put in soil in 2011 and it led to this. No, there were deep cuts, deep deep ruptures and
fractures.
Fractures
Yes.
in these 10 years and a half.
I think we have made a few points that are very relevant to the Museum of Activism. I would like to give all our gathered friends the chance to, ask a question, to comment. But before we do that, I would like to throw a little bit of sparkles to our discussion. We went through the gradual, I don't want to say degeneration, but the progress of activism into much harsher war and the repression. You mentioned Sarut. Sarut used to stand in Hummus and sing with Fadwa Suleiman. Women were very involved. There were a lot of activism from different segments of society. We mentioned the documentation. Our activists also became citizen journalists at a very early stage, and were faced with an immediate response from most of the world with, we were mentioning this earlier, like alleged or cannot be independently verified. And from very early on, Syrian activists found themselves, in addition to providing the proof of what they have, trying to justify that, no, their word mattered. And, we had a lot of reactions from the world, from leftist movements, which we did not expect. I think all of us speak about this. So, maybe a couple of words on that while I look to see if anybody wants to comment, agree, disagree, or ask a question, Yassin. Tell us something about how we feel about
it. It has been good up to now.
Yeah, we have to get into realpolitik, I'm afraid.
This is a personal shock for me, actually. I'm a leftist. I was in jail because I was communist, and I'm no longer a communist, but I still think of myself as a leftist. So it is a shock, a personal shock, that in our struggle we found most of what I call top-down anti-imperialists are not supporting our struggle. We are dismissed as irrelevant, or maybe it is just tools in a regime change plan by the US imperialism. Actually, the regime change was our idea. It was our struggle. This is the regime that we want to topple. The main slogan of the whole Arab Spring is the people who want to overthrow the regime. So it was our initiative, we didn't wait for the Americans to have a plan for our regime change. So it is just a mixture of extreme ignorance and extreme arrogance when someone like Max Blumenthal or Ben Norton or come to tell us that we are unaware tools, unconscious tools in a struggle that it was the plan of imperialism. Now it is our plan. Imperialism, if ever the US administrations did something, it is to prevent the regime from falling. Actually, And it was clear since even before the chemical deal, which is worse than the chemical massacre, in my opinion. Every time I remember this, I think it was a gift to the Assad regime that has, at that time, that had just killed 1,466 people, and it was a gift to the nihilist Islamists. Because when people feel betrayed and left to be killed, even with chemical weapons, this was a gift to the most radicalized and most extremist elements of Islamists. They always capitalize when the world is showing indifference when the people were being killed. So I don't actually, I see Syria as an example of the old-fashioned approaches of the most of the, there are many decent people everywhere actually, leftists, even here in Germany, not so many, in the US, everywhere, but their problematic is old. They are still fighting, supposedly fighting, because I don't see them doing anything actually. They are still fighting against imperialism, a battle that our struggle should be annexed to it. And apart from the fact that I don't see them doing anything actually, why do you want to annex our struggle to yours? I mean, annexation, imperialism is exactly to annex other countries or other struggles. So this is imperialist. This is imperialism. You are telling me that even for your country, we know better than you, and you have to conform to our approach, to accept our analysis, and you don't know, as we know, because we live, it happens that they live in MIT or in Washington or in Paris or in London. So it is a shock, it is a scandal actually. And I hope something more creative will come out of it on the level of analysis and hopefully on the level of networking. You know, it is time for it.
I would add to what you're saying, the word that I personally tend to use with this, which is selective anti-imperialism, is something that Syrian activists and Syrian revolutionaries and Syrians of all walks of life have struggled with for 10 years. And as Yassin says, it's an incredibly unfair weight and burden that has been added to the incredible violence and injustice that Syrians have endured. I think it is also a very important fact that even after all this, and even after Syrians were abandoned, basically, by the very people who they thought would be carrying their cause, as they have other causes, just causes, I think this has had a huge effect also on, on the feelings of abandonment, not just physically, militarily, diplomatically, but also in this struggle. And I wanted to ask if anybody would like to make a comment, and I think Ola has been dying to make a comment.